hear you while we're lining up the jurors.
Just before the close of court today, it's possible to get a long
motion because it's going to take the jurors a while to assemble.
It's a motion to admit evidence of the conditions of confinement were there to be a verdict of not criminally responsible. And what I propose, I filed a motion on Friday. What I propose to do is to call the superintendent of Bridgewater State Hospital and elicit from him that were the court to order Mr. Chism to Bridgewater State Hospital, what the conditions would be. It's a fairly narrow set of facts, which is simply that he would be held, that the facility is operated by the Department of Corrections, the things about the facility that are prison-like, that were he to be ordered there before the age of 18, he would be staffed one-on-one at all times.
All right, so I guess I have two things. One is to hear what the Commonwealth's response is, and number two, obviously we have an instruction that's only about, 10 or 12 days old now from Chapel. And so I'd like to hear from the Commonwealth. I'd also like to hear whether, I understand that we have new instructions, so one could argue that the probative value is different with the new instruction. I'm not saying it is by any means, but I'd like to know if this has ever been admitted before in any case of this kind as well. All right, so I understand your motion, and I'll address it. We'll let the jury go a little early today to address it. Although we may, there's some, I know there's some legal issues that are pressing that need to be addressed, so we may need to have a little time this afternoon anyway. All right, are they ready?
Yes.
All right, thank you.
Hear ye, hear ye. All persons having anything to do for the Honorable David Lowy, Justice of the Superior Court, now sitting at Salem, within and for this county of Essex, draw near. Give your attendance and you shall be heard. God save the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. This court is now in session. You may be seated.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The jury, the court officers told me that you were all here at 20 of 9. Wow. I have a series of questions for all of you. If you can answer any of my questions, yes, please raise your hand. Otherwise, there's no need to respond verbally to any of my questions. Any of the jurors have any difficulty following the instructions from the court not to discuss the case among yourselves or with anybody else? Any of the jurors have any difficulty following the instructions of the court not to do any independent investigation concerning this case and avoid any information from any source other than one in the courtroom? Is there any serious and substantial issue involving your jury duty that you need to alert the court to at this time? None of the jurors have answered affirmatively. If we could have the witness resume the stand.
I'm afraid if I force it, it'll cut him off.
You can head right up to the doctor.
Okay, good morning, Dr. Gutley. You remain under oath. Thank you. Yes, please, Ms. McDougall.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
Now, Doctor, on Friday, we were talking about some of the testing that was done of Philip Chism, understanding it wasn't any testing that you had ordered. Is that correct?
The testing we were talking about?
Well, you didn't order any testing, did you?
I did.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll get to that. You certainly had an opportunity to review the DYS records. I believe you testified on direct, and all of the other records relevant to Philip Chism. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And in March of 2014, 5 months after Ms. Ritzer was murdered,
Mr. Chism was given some IQ testing, is that correct?
I believe that's correct.
And specifically, he was given, and I apologize if I mispronounce this, but the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, 4th edition, is that correct?
I don't remember specifically, but I know he was given a Wechsler.
Okay. One of the Wechslers, and it was and that's essentially, for the layperson, an IQ test, correct?
Essentially.
Okay. And that's a test, that's a cognitive measure. That's a test of cognition, is that correct?
It's a test of intelligence.
Right. So it shouldn't change.
The Wechsler?
Right. Over the course of one's life, your intelligence doesn't change, does it?
No, but the I'm not a psychologist, so I don't feel really expert on testifying on these tests.
Okay.
But he had the
certainly
test.
you would agree with me that his testing on the Wechsler in March of 2014 across the board was either in the average or high average range.
That's correct.
Okay. But then in June of 2015, he was given an adult Wechsler. Is that correct?
I believe so.
Okay. And so now we're in June of 2015. We're some 18 months past the murder of Miss Ritzer, and we're 3 months.
Your Honor, the issue of whether it's a murder or not is up to the jury, not the Commonwealth.
I'll sustain the objection.
18 months after the defendant's arrest, in June of 2015, he was administered an adult Wechsler IQ test. Is that correct?
I know he was administered an adult IQ test.
And this is 3 months after you've begun meeting with him, before. So you said, I believe, February is when you start to...
I first met with him in March, I believe.
And on June 25th of 2015, when he's given the adult Wechsler, he scores below the first percentile. Is that correct?
I believe so.
So low that he wouldn't be functioning. Is that correct?
That I don't have an opinion.
Well, he's beneath 1% of the population
on
the adult Wechsler.
I don't feel like that's an area that I should
Well, Doctor, absent catastrophic head injury the day before, do you have any explanation for why he would score less than 1% on a cognition test in June of 2015?
What I'm saying is that there's a variety of factors that impacts on a person's ability to perform on these tests. And I think that that's a question more appropriately put to a psychologist who actually administers the test.
Okay. But those factors that were present in June of 2015, according to you, weren't present in March of 2014, were they?
Objection.
Based on the last answer, I'll sustain the objection. As to the area of inquiry that you're pursuing, you can pursue it.
Let me ask you this, Doctor. Understanding you're not a psychologist, certainly psychiatrists use testing that is done by psychologists in their evaluation of someone, particularly in the forensic area. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Did you at all consider this dramatic change in his testing in June of 2015?
Yes.
And how did you explain it?
I didn't explain it. You asked me, did I consider it? I considered it. It didn't change my opinion.
You considered it and rejected it, essentially.
No, I said I considered it, and it didn't change my opinion.
Well, Doctor, is there any testing prior to June of 2015 that you have reviewed that in any way supports your opinion that Mr. Chism was experiencing psychosis in October of 2013?
So could you...
Objection.
You need the question restated, Doctor?
Yes.
Is there any testing that you have reviewed prior to June of 2015 that supports your opinion that the defendant was experiencing psychosis in October of 2013?
Prior to June of 2015?
Yes.
No.
And you are aware that you, I believe, testified on direct on Friday that you reviewed testing done by Dr. Nancy Hebben for the presence of malingering. Is that correct?
I reviewed her test, yes.
And certainly nothing about her testing changed your opinion that Mr. Chism was experiencing psychosis on October 22nd of 2013.
That's correct.
And in fact, you didn't administer or requested any test be administered on the specific issue of malingering, did you?
No.
In fact, the only assessment you did of malingering was your own assessment in your interviews of Philip Chism.
My own assessment in my interviews of Mr. Chism, and as well as other sources of information that were available to me.
What other sources of information?
The interviews with his mother, the other interviews of other family members and people who knew him, the reports of the students, the things that we went over in direct.
So based on the reports of those students from the math class, Alexandria Starling, Kara Bean, Rania Radui, the two soccer players, and you say the family from Tennessee, that's what, and Mrs. Chism, that's what corroborated your finding that Mr. Chism was not malingering?
That's what corroborated my finding that he was suffering from a psychotic disorder.
But you didn't really assess malingering, did you?
I assessed malingering as it related to the psychotic disorder.
Now, you made certain observations of the defendant when you were meeting him that you believed confirmed he was experiencing auditory hallucinations. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Did you consider at all observations made by those, contained in the record by those when, at times when Mr. Chism didn't realize anyone was observing him?
Yes.
And fair to say there were observations in the record that were not consistent with the idea that Mr. Chism was experiencing auditory hallucinations?
I would say that there were observations in the records in which there was no observation of him, or no observation that was understood to be one where he was experiencing auditory hallucinations.
Well, these were people who part of their job is that they unfortunately view people who are experiencing auditory hallucinations, correct?
I understand that.
Is that true? I know you understand it, but is that correct? That the people whose records you were reviewing are people who, in their day-to-day life, watch people who are hearing voices?
That I don't know.
And those people did not make any observations of Mr. Chism consistent with him hearing voices, did they?
I know there were reports in the records of those who felt that they did not observe him hearing voices.
And certainly when you were interviewing Mr. Chism, he knew you were looking at him.
Presumably.
Right. I mean, you're in a one-on-one situation, basically.
That's correct.
And in fact, with respect to Sarah Young, his ongoing counselor at DYS, you used your interview with her as part of, to sort of bolster your belief that Mr. Chism had experienced some kind of childhood trauma. Is that correct?
I reported that she had the same sense that there was a trauma history that she hadn't gotten at.
But there were a lot of things that Ms. Young told you that you didn't report, weren't there?
I'm not quite sure what you're referencing.
Okay. Well, certainly Ms. Young reported that while certainly Philip was often flat, there were other times when he smiled, he was exuberant, he engaged with people, including her, particularly in those first few months at DYS.
So you're asking me, did she tell me that?
Yeah.
I can't find my note. If she did, it's not included in my report.
Right, well, the only thing you include in your report regarding the observations of Ms. Young is the things that bolstered your opinion about Mr. Chism having suffered a childhood trauma, correct?
Well, I didn't summarize any of her notes and things like that. I mean, I was responding really to my conversation with her.
And certainly the person
I mean, there's,
being,
I'm sorry.
I apologize.
I mean, there's a lot in her notes. I mean, she writes notes over a period of her time with him, and she talks about different affects, different experiences.
Certainly, and she was seeing Philip Chism almost every day in November of 2013, December of 2013, January of 2014.
Correct.
And she never observed anything she believed was consistent with him hearing voices, did she?
I can't say that I remember all of those notes, but my memory is that her main impression was that it was he had trauma-related difficulties and not a psychotic process.
She didn't see any evidence of psychosis in November or December of 2013, did she?
What I'm saying is what I remember is that she did not believe he had a psychotic process.
He didn't have a psychotic process because he wasn't experiencing psychosis.
I'm telling you what I remember.
Okay. Now, you testified on direct that you believe the onset of this psychosis was when Mr. Chism was 10 years old. Is that correct?
Approximately.
And that is based on his report of when these voices started. Is that correct?
That's correct.
There's no other support for the notion that this psychosis, onset of this psychosis, was 10 years old, is there?
That's correct.
And in fact, 10 would be a fairly rare young age for there to be an onset of psychosis, wouldn't it?
That's correct.
So rare that you might even report it to the NIH, is that correct?
No.
But very rare that psychosis would onset as early as 10.
Early onset is not the common age of onset. It's not. I wouldn't describe it in the way that you're describing it.
But the only support for the idea it started at 10 is because that's when Mr. Chism told you he started hearing these voices.
That's correct.
And you are aware, Dr. Dudley, that he has told other people that he started hearing these voices at other times. Is that correct?
Yes.
As young as 5 or 6, maybe even as young as 2. Is that correct?
I don't remember that.
Okay. And that would certainly be extremely rare, wouldn't it?
2 would be extremely rare.
Now, did you have further conversation with Mr. Chism regarding the nature of these voices?
Yes.
And that's, in addition to informing your opinion, it's also a way to check for malingering, isn't it?
Yes.
Because people who don't experience genuine psychosis sometimes have the wrong idea about how voices work, don't they?
Well, it's that, and as well as kind of other things that go along with it.
And how many voices did Mr. Chism report hearing?
He reported hearing a voice.
A voice, a single voice.
Yes.
Is that correct? Was he able to identify that voice as male or female?
Eventually, male.
Did he report that that voice was external or internal, meaning that that voice was coming from inside his head or coming into his head from the outside?
He reported that he could hear it as clearly as he could hear my voice. At different times, trying to explain where it was and what the source of it was, he was all over the place with that.
A little bit what?
He was all over the place with that.
And in fact, once again, are you aware that Mr. Chism has made other statements regarding the number of voices, the quality of voices, and the gender of the voices he hears to other clinicians?
Yes.
Did that factor at all into your consideration?
Did I consider it?
Yes.
Yes, I did.
Does it in any way change your belief that Mr. Chism is malingering or not malingering?
It doesn't change my opinion with regard to the psychotic process.
Okay. Now, I want to go back very briefly to the actual day of this event. You talked about Mr. Chism's exchange with Ramsey, his exchange with Mr. Hebert. With respect to, you're familiar with a young woman named Autumn Ciani, is that correct?
Yes. And the name?
If I told you she was the girl in the classroom, does that help?
That's correct. That helps. Thank you.
And certainly some of her observations you relied on in forming your opinion, that she saw him, I think she said, talking to himself and looking out the window. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Did you consider at all the fact that she says immediately prior to Ms. Ritzer returning to the classroom, she had an exchange with Mr. Chism at the whiteboard where he spoke to her, made eye contact with her, wasn't mumbling, and wasn't appearing to have any difficulties speaking to her?
Did I consider that?
Yes.
Yes, I did.
But once again, it's fair to say that doesn't change your opinion that he was experiencing a psychotic process, correct?
That's correct.
Let me ask you about how long you believe that Mr. Chism was experiencing psychosis, non-specific psychosis, at the time of the event. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, say that.
It was a bad question. You believe that Mr. Chism was experiencing psychosis at the time he killed Colleen Ritzer. Is that correct?
That's correct.
How long do you believe that psychosis lasted?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean.
Well, has Mr. Chism been in the throes of psychosis ever since?
It's my opinion that he's been experiencing a psychotic process ever since. The intensity of the voices and the difficulties that he has with it is what ebbs and flows. And when it ebbs, he is capable of a fair amount of lucidity. Is that correct? Say that once more. Does he have lucid periods? Does he have lucid intervals? He has lucid intervals, but he's also, I mean, it doesn't affect his intelligence. And so it kind of depends on what's going on. I mean, it's not like he can't be lucid and psychotic at the same time. And in fact, he attended school regularly when he first arrived at DYS. He was functioning with his peers in a relatively normal way. He was managing day to day. Is that correct? When he first came to DYS? Yeah. More or less. And you indicated that the psychosis doesn't affect his intelligence. Does it affect his capacity for empathy? It depends on let me put it this way. There's a variety of variables. One is, what's the intensity of the voice at any particular point in time, whether it's so intense that it's commanding, at a level of commanding where he has to respond to it, as opposed to whether it's more quiescent where he can ignore it. It's going to depend on the content of what the voices are saying. And so that it goes directly also to your question as to what the content of the voices are saying will affect how he's feeling in a variety of ways, including empathy. Well, let me ask you this, Dr. Dudley, stepping away from Mr. Chism for a moment. Okay. A person who's experiencing acute psychosis who commits a violent crime, would you expect them at some point afterwards, when they are medicated or lucid for whatever reason, to be hit with the reality of what they did in the throes of their psychosis? Certainly after they're medicated, yeah. And you would expect them then to be profoundly remorseful, wouldn't you? They could be profoundly remorseful, they could be profoundly confused, there could be a whole bunch of different sorts of feelings, which relate not only to the treatment of the psychosis, but also relate to just other factors.
I'm having trouble hearing Dr.
Could you just project your voice, if you could, please, Doctor?
I'll try.
Well, at no point in any of your meetings with Philip Chism has he experienced any...
I think I know what the question is, and I'll allow it as relates to the words used or the observation.
Talked to him at least somewhat about the events of October 22nd, 2013, is that correct?
Yes, I have.
And without getting into the details, does he...
Maybe heard it sidebar?
Sure.
Dr. Dudley, last week you indicated that you've met with Philip Chism starting in, I believe, March of 2015 and as recently as last week. Is that correct?
That's correct.
At any time during any of your meetings with Mr. Chism, has he expressed to you remorse or empathy regarding the events of October 22nd?
Objection.
Overruled.
Yes.
When was that?
The last time I saw him. Not the last time I saw him. In September.
That was remorse that he hadn't been more effective in ignoring the voices. Is that correct?
He talked about a variety of things, not really understanding that the voices were an illness, not being able to manage it, being helpless in response to the voices. He talked about a variety of things, and that and how that resulted in behaviors that were really not him. Then when I saw him this last time, which was last Thursday, there was much more of a sense of having had an illness that had not been treated, and had that been treated, he wouldn't have caused the difficulties that he's caused.
Caused the difficulties that he's caused?
Yes.
Dr. Dudley?
To this family.
If he hadn't listened to the voices, he wouldn't have caused the difficulties that he caused to his family?
No, to the victim's family.
Well, that's not what you said, is it?
I said to this family.
And is that how he described them, difficulties, Dr. Dudley?
I think it's pretty hard for him to talk about this.
Dr. Dudley, in your evaluation of the events of October 22nd, 2013, did you consider at all the sexual aspects?
Yes, I did.
And how did you consider them? Because they don't really appear at all in your report, do they?
I was left with some questions.
Because you didn't find any answers in anything you reviewed, did you?
I didn't find an answer that I felt that I could opine on with a reasonable. I think as I mentioned on Friday, it's clear to me that he has, in addition to these psychotic symptoms, pretty clear symptoms of trauma-related difficulties. And so, of course, I have suspicions about that, but I was never able to really get a clear handle on the underlying traumas that I felt like I could opine on them with certainty.
Well, certainly the sexual violence inherent in what he did to Colleen Ritzer is not accounted for entirely by this psychosis, is it?
That's correct.
And so you then decided that if he had experienced similar trauma in childhood himself, that would help explain the entire behavior, is that correct?
No. Let's see how. It's not uncommon for people's experiences to get incorporated into the content of a psychotic process. And so while I believe that it was ultimately mediated through the psychotic process, the content of it, I believe, was probably also informed by other experiences.
But Mr. Chism adamantly denied to you any history of sexual abuse, didn't he?
He denied any history of abuse, neglect, difficulties, and at some but that when questioned about the symptoms that he was exhibiting of trauma-related difficulties, then he would say, "I won't talk about it."
I won't. talk about it,
I
correct?
can't talk about it.
You can't talk
I mean, he said different things that, sometimes he would say, I can't talk about it. Sometimes he would say, I won't talk about it.
But when
Sometimes he
asked-
would say, I'm being told not to talk about it. So it was different things. But the bottom line is, he didn't talk about it.
And when asked explicitly, he denied physical or sexual abuse as a child, didn't he?
That's correct.
To you and to everyone else in the records,
That's
correct?
correct.
And in fact, his mother denies physical or sexual abuse of Philip. Is that correct?
I mean, that she ever sexually or physically abused him?
Or observed anyone else doing it?
She certainly denied that she ever sexually or physically abused him. And she... I think she denied ever seeing anybody sexually or physically abuse him.
And let me ask you this. To the extent you have testified that you relied on your interview with Mrs. Chism, that would be your September 2015 interview, correct?
That's correct.
Did you consider at all her statement of October 23rd, 2013?
And to other evaluators?
To the police?
Oh, I'm sorry. 2013?
Yes.
Yes.
And did you consider at all any inconsistencies between those two reports?
Yes.
In assessing Ms. Chisholm's credibility in relying on her interview?
Yes.
But it didn't change anything?
It didn't change my opinion as to whether he has a psychotic process.
Now, Doctor, ultimately, you produced, initially at least, an 11-page report in this case. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the first, call it a page, a little more than a page, is just an introductory paragraph and then a listing of all the sources of information that you relied on. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So that would leave a balance of about a little less than 10 pages. Is that correct?
I guess, yes.
And approximately 8 to 9 pages of your report is dedicated to what Mr. Chism told you, isn't it?
That's correct.
Leaving a page of other sources. Facts are not my strong suit, Dr. Dudley, but about 90% of your report relies on the statements of Philip Chism. Is that correct?
Of the report?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, and in fact, 80 to 90% of your opinion relies on Philip Chism, doesn't it?
I would say that my opinion, I mean, my examinations of him are an important part of my opinion. But I also believe that the other sources of information available to me were also important.
Well, let me ask you this, Doctor. You testified on Friday that whether he ever pretended to have difficulties he didn't have or manipulate staff, his psychiatric symptoms are credible. Is that correct? That was your testimony on Friday.
With regard to the psychotic process, yes.
Okay. And in fact, not only did you conclude that Philip Chism was malingering, you never even discussed malingering in your report, did you?
I don't believe so.
You never even raised the possibility that what he was telling you is either not true at all or exaggerated, did you?
In the report,
Yes.
Objection. May I be heard at sidebar?
Sure.
Dr. Dudley, you never, nothing in your report, and frankly nothing in your opinion, considered the possibility that Philip Chism isn't telling you the absolute truth about these voices, did it, and his other symptoms.
I considered that.
But you believe, based on your interactions with him, that he was being accurate, correct?
With regard to the psychotic process, yes.
Well, what do you mean by that? You keep saying that, Doctor.
Exactly what I said. I mean, I'm not sure what your question is.
If he doesn't hear voices, if he's not hearing voices, does that change your opinion?
It's my opinion that he is hearing voices, and so that would make a difference, yes.
Right. Because if he's not hearing voices, then no one's telling him what to do on October 22nd of 2013, are they?
That's correct.
And if he's not hearing voices, then there is absolutely no explanation for his conduct on October 22nd of 2013, except that it was volitional. Is that correct?
I wouldn't say that, but I would say that the fact that he's hearing voices is an important issue.
Well, is it your testimony that in the absence of these reported voices, you could find that he was experiencing psychosis on October 22nd of 2013, based on the other evidence that you have, other than him reporting hearing auditory hallucination?
I'm sorry, you lost me.
Fair enough. It was a long question. If Philip Chism doesn't hear voices, take that, I understand you believe that, but take that out of the equation. Is there enough evidence to conclude that Philip Chism is experiencing psychosis in October of 2013?
No, I believe that the auditory hallucinations are a central feature.
The one male voice that he ultimately reported hearing to you,
Correct.
that he reported having heard since he was 10,
Correct.
which is the basis for your opinion that this psychosis began at 10.
Correct.
If I could just have one moment, Your Honor.
You direct anything?
Maybe see next sidebar, Your Honor.
Sure.
Good morning, Dr. Dudley.
Good morning.
Did you request testing?
Yes, I did.
What forms of testing did you request?
I requested a form of testing where there are scans of the brain to look for whether there are actual changes in the brain that are consistent with the diagnosis of a psychotic disorder.
And were those scans done?
Yes, they were.
And were they consistent with your opinion?
Sustained.
Did you consider them informing your opinion?
Yes, I did.
Did you receive the results of those scans before or after you wrote your main report?
After.
Now, on Friday, the prosecutor asked you some questions about an article you wrote about mitigation work in capital cases, correct?
That's correct.
And can you explain the difference between mitigation work and an evaluation for lack of criminal responsibility?
Yeah. When you're doing mitigation work, you're really doing an evaluation to present to the jury after they've already found a person guilty of a crime, and it's particularly done in capital litigation when the jury then has to make a decision as to whether the person should receive the death penalty or not. And so that the mental health information that the jury gets is for the purpose of helping them to decide whether this is a person who should get the death penalty or some other, like life in prison or some other sentence. And so you're really talking about helping them understand how the person got to where they are. When you're doing an evaluation in connection with an affirmative defense such as this, it's a much more rare, unusual sort of thing where you do a psychiatric evaluation and find that the person's mental illness is such that the question of their actual responsibility is going to be raised. And so it's a much more rare, I mean, I think in the course of my 30-some years, I mean, it's been a rare occurrence that issue of their actual criminal responsibility is that question, as opposed to mitigation, where you're talking about, well, how bad is this? You know, what kind of punishment should the person get? And it doesn't affect the fact that you've already found them guilty.
Now, Dr. Dudley, the prosecutor asked you some questions about recommendations that you made in this article about mitigation in capital cases. And she said that said something about you not advising not to do brain scans or psychological testing. Could you explain?
What we were as I indicated the other day when I was asked about this is a paper that was written to try to explain different standards that have been set for what makes a legal team's efforts to develop mitigation in these capital cases, because it was particularly about capital cases. You know, what is the standard of practice? What is it that they're supposed to be doing? And what we were trying to argue against was that this is not a situation where, you know, an attorney should get together and just order everything, you know, just indiscriminately order everything. That decisions about testing should be based on having done some work to see what kind of testing might be indicated, whether scans were indicated or not. Just so, because it just seemed that so many legal teams, in an attempt to respond to the standard of making sure they did mitigation, were just kind of indiscriminately doing everything without having given any thought. So it's not a testing should never be done sort of argument. It's that testing should be, there should be a thoughtful decision about what you're going to do and what kinds of tests you're going to do, based on having done some work and knowing something about your client.
Now, how did you consider Philip Chism's ability on October 22nd to find a barrel, a large enough barrel, and successfully shoplift? How did that figure into your opinion?
I didn't believe that was inconsistent with the opinion that the driving force behind the killing was psychotic.
And why is that?
because that mental health difficulty doesn't affect your capacity to do those other things.
Pardon me?
That mental health difficulty doesn't affect your capacity to do those other things.
Is that, you had talked on cross-examination about intellect and psychosis.
Correct.
Can you explain a little more about that?
Well, the point I was trying to make is that it doesn't make, having a psychotic process doesn't mean that you have an intellectual deficit. And so, you know, you could be an intelligent person and still have a psychosis. At any given, you know, might that affect? So, say for example, if you are at the moment, you know, hearing auditory hallucinations that are so strong that you can't ignore them, that you have to respond to them, that they're at that level that we call command hallucinations. Okay, that may be sufficiently distracting that there would be certain things that you couldn't do at that moment, but it doesn't have an overall effect on your intellectual process. And when the intensity of that passes, you know, you would be able to function intellectually.
So when someone is in the throes of command hallucinations, they may act in ways to perpetuate the command of the hallucination.
I mean, it doesn't change my opinion with regard to a response to command hallucinations. Let me just restate the fact that you know, that the central issue in a psychotic process is that it's irrational.
Pardon me?
The central issue in a psychotic process is that it's irrational. So, you know, some I don't want to speculate a rational explanation for an irrational act.
Now, do people who are under the influence of command hallucinations at that level of psychosis, do they always appear psychotic?
What do you mean?
Would the people around them necessarily know that they were under the influence of command hallucinations?
Not necessarily.
Can you explain?
Well, the response, right, the mumbling that we've been talking about periodically, the attempt to respond to internal stimuli depends on how the person's reacting. So what I was describing during my interviews with him is that I would ask him a question, you know, say the voice would tell him to respond or not respond, and he would be responding to the voice and then not responding to me. It could very well be that if the voices are so low that you don't have to respond, then you wouldn't be obviously responding to some sort of internal stimuli. Or the voices can be so compelling and so strong that you're not challenging them, that you're not talking back, that you're not responding. So you're acting in response to those stimuli, but you're not trying to talk with it or argue with it or respond to it. Is that clear?
Yes. So now, the Commonwealth asked you about testimony in 3 high publicity cases, correct? On cross-examination.
They mentioned them.
Pardon me?
They mentioned 3 cases.
Yes. And those were cases that have high publicity, correct?
Yes.
And have you testified in cases where there's been no publicity?
Yes. Yes.
And in the past 2 years, could you tell us what cases you've testified where there's been little publicity?
Probably not. I mean.
In what forums have you testified in the past 2 years?
Local, state, local courts. I do a lot of civil cases. They're not criminal cases at all that no one's particularly interested in. I've recently done several Hague Convention cases, which are kind of kept quiet.
What are Hague Convention cases?
I'll sustain the objection. The redirect, I think, makes the point. You can have further inquiry, though, as to the question. I'm not cutting off the list that you wanted to go through over the last 2 years.
Well, I object.
All right, I'll see counsel decide about it.
Now, Dr. Dudley, why would you want a brain scan study so long after the incident?
Can I have that question one more time? Why would you want a what?
Why would you want a brain scan done so long after the incident?
Are you talking about in mitigation cases or
In this case,
I'll sustain the objection. It goes beyond the point of the cross.
Did you request psychological testing?
No.
Why not?
In an adolescent who, in my opinion, was suffering from at least 2 major psychiatric difficulties, I wasn't certain that that was the best testing to go for.
Can you explain a little further?
Well, in the sense that it would give me some clear additional information.
You anticipated that the testing would be ambiguous?
Just the combination of trauma-related symptoms and psychotic symptoms might be ambiguous, and I simply chose an approach to testing that I thought would give me at least something more clear.
And why brain scans in particular?
Sustained. I'll put counsel to the sidebar.
Now, you met with Philip Chism on December 3rd, 2015, correct?
That's correct.
And
Sure.
now, Dr. Dudley, when you approach a evaluation on the issue of criminal responsibility, what role does assessing malingering play in your evaluation generally?
It's a required piece of the differential assessment.
And why is that?
Well, by definition, malingering is, as I indicated in the direct, pretending to be more ill than you really are, and in some cases even pretending to be more healthy than you really are, because of what we call secondary gain you can get out of that. And in any sort of legal proceeding where there would be an advantage to being ill, or an advantage to not being ill, one has to consider that that's going on.
And did you consider malingering over the course of your interviews with Mr. Chism?
Yes.
How did Mr. Chism's age figure into your assessment of him and your opinion?
Well, there's his age in actual chronological years, and then there's his age in the sense of his emotional maturity. So you know that he has an adolescent brain as opposed to an adult brain, and so that you have to consider that in how he's dealing, how he's handling things, the kind of immature capacity for decision making, etc., that would be part of the adolescent brain. And then you're considering the fact that emotionally he seems even less mature than his years, and so that goes into the mix of not only his history and how he's handled his history, but how he's handling his actual interaction with you.
If I could have a moment, Your Honor.
Sure.
Your Honor, we have the one remaining issue.
Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to take the morning recess early so I can discuss some issues of law with counsel, and the morning recess may take a little bit more than the normal time. Don't discuss the case among yourselves with anybody else during the recess. The first thing I'll do when you come back in the court is make sure you follow those instructions. Court will remain in session. Jurors are excused.
All rise.